Okay, so next we want to go ahead and fix some of the problems we made when we got rid of the boy here. If you look closely, I did a Control-0 to get an overview of the image to zoom out. And if you look closely here, this looks a little bit rough. There's some repeated pixels here. And in the background out here on the right side, this doesn't look quite right. You got that wall thing repeating twice. So we'll use our clone stamp tool to copy and paste some pixels to see if we can't smooth out some of those problems. So come over here to the clone stamp tool, S on the keyboard, clone stamp tool. So we'll go for a 60 pixel brush, 30 hardness. So I'll use my bracket key to take me up to 60. I'll come down to my hardness and get myself to 30% hardness. We don't want a hard edge brush when we copy pixels, otherwise you'll get an obvious line. So I'm going to zoom in now. Again, I'll use my Control Plus to zoom in, get a decent close-up of this area. And the trick with the clone stamp tool is pretty straightforward, but you want to make sure that you select the correct pixels. I suggest selecting pixels that are close to the things you're trying to copy over. So if I look here, there's some blank pixels in here I can select. I'm going to Alt-click with my clone stamp tool, Option-click on the Mac, Alt-click here, and that will select those pixels to copy. I'm going to try to make sure I have some pixels that look kind of plain. So these look plain here. When I Alt-click, now I'm copying those pixels. I'm going to go and paste those over here to remove that duplicated piece of the wall there. So that little extra thing is not there twice. Similarly, I'll come down here, and I'm going to Alt-click right here, Alt-click here, and use those pixels to cover up that extra line there. And again, I'll Alt-click here, and then regular click here to cover up those things on the wall. Still got a little bit of a repeated pattern, but I don't think you'll notice that. Certainly won't notice as much as having those other pixels repeated. The other thing is that sometimes these things you wouldn't really notice unless you're looking for them. This is not terrible over here, but I'll do a little bit of Alt-clicking and see if I can't go and copy some of these pixels here. If you see when we removed the boy, what Photoshop did was it took a little piece of this building and put it on top of this building. So I'm going to come here and play with it a little bit. I will Alt-click over here to try to take some pieces of this and put it on top of that, and also try to smooth this wall out a little bit. So I'll use these pixels here. I'll Alt-click, and I'll use those to paint over, kind of repeat that pattern across the building. In this case, the building does repeat, so it doesn't look so strange that you have the same thing across. Similarly, I'm actually going to switch to a slightly smaller brush for this, go down a couple of brush sizes by using my bracket key, and I'll Alt-click here, and then I'll click over on here and kind of repeat that pattern across there. Lastly, I'll see if I can't fix this wall, and I'll Alt-click here, copy this piece right here again, copy this piece right here, Alt-click, and then I'll paste it over on here to make that wall kind of straighten out. So that's not perfect, but it's not terrible. We could certainly spend more time and make that look better, but that's a fast pass at using the clone stamp tool to erase some of the duplicated pixels and make our patterns look more normal. I'll do Control-0. I do recommend doing Control-0. I have to say that if you look closely, you do see a repeated pattern, but I think if you're not looking for it, it just kind of looks like part of the building. So depending on how much that piece that you're clone stamping is part of the focus of the image, I don't think people are going to notice that. So again, this portion of the exercise is a little open-ended. You can do as much clone stamping as you feel necessary. This is good enough for me, and this is certainly good enough for our purposes in this class. If you want to go more and do more detail, zoom in, clone stamp with smaller brushes. Just remember, if you're clone stamping, to zoom out. Sometimes you can get so focused on making sure that things look good in a tiny little area that you lose track of the big picture. So if you're zoomed in and you're working, be sure to zoom out and realize that thing you spent an hour on is a small, tiny little detail that people probably won't even notice. Lastly, what we'll do is we'll see if we can't sharpen this picture and get rid of some of the noise that came from the scan. I'm going to zoom in. I can keep clicking with my zoom tool to get to about 400%. You can see there's lots of noise. There's all kinds of stuff in there. I use my space bar when you zoomed in. Holding down the space bar lets you drag around. If you look at the boy's shirt, you can see all those blue dots. That's noise. We want to get rid of that. So we'll use a filter to get rid of the dust and scratches. I want to point out that the filter we're using is what's called a destructive filter, and that is actually changing the pixels on this background layer that we're working on. What you might do if you didn't want to be destructive, if you wanted to go back, is to duplicate the layer. We'll learn about doing that later. You might duplicate the layer before you put the filter on. I probably would do that, but we haven't worked with that yet, so we will save that for another day. So I'll just go and use my filter. I'll come up here to the filter menu, and again, in the filter menu, these filters are destructive. They change pixels. The adjustment layer filters do not. So in the filter menu, I'll come down here under noise, and I'll come down and choose dust and scratches. So we'll leave the settings, which is a 1 pixel radius, and we'll make our threshold, leave our threshold at 0, and we'll see how that does. I'll hit OK, and you can see already that's done a great job of getting rid of some of that noise. I'll do Control-0 to zoom out, and I'll do a before and after. I'll do Control-Z. Here's what it looked like before. Here's what it looks like after. You can see it looks a little bit blurrier, but the noise is gone. Again, if you zoom in and do that, Control-Z. Here's my zoom in. Control-Z to undo. Control-Z to redo. Not quite as sharp, but all the noise is gone. So now that we lost some sharpness, let's see if we can add another filter to sharpen it up a little bit. We'll choose Filter, and under Sharpen, there are several different choices. We'll come down and choose Smart Sharpen. This gives us the Smart Sharpen dialog box. We'll come in here and make sure that Preview is selected so we can see what this thing looks like. We'll leave that selected. I'll come down and make sure that Lens Blur is what we're removing. And we'll change our slider, our mount, to about 60%, how much sharpening we'll do. So we'll change it to 60%. And you can, of course, click in here and type in 60, which is what I'll do. 60 and tab. And I tab over to get me to the radius. I'll type in there 1.5. And again, if the book is telling you to choose an exact number, it's almost always easier to type than to drag. So I'll hit OK and see how that looks. And I'll zoom out. And again, I can do a Control-Z to do a before and after. Here's before, here's after. And I don't know how well you can see in this recording, but when I look closely at the screen, the after definitely looks sharper. So Control-Z before, Control-Z after, better. I think I'll save this. File, save. And that's it for lesson 2.